For the last 80 years or so, the entire world has pretty much run on one basic economic assumption, that all roads, one way or another, lead back to the United States and the US dollar. Well, that assumption is now breaking apart, and it's happening at an incredible speed. So let's dive into what might just be the most significant global realignment of our lifetimes.
And look, that's not just my take on it, that's a direct quote from Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, speaking to the world's elite at Davos. The key word he uses there is rupture. This isn't some gentle, predictable shift we've seen coming for years. Nope, it's a sudden, structural break from the past, and it's forcing every major nation to totally rethink its place in the world.
So naturally, this brings us to the big, headline-grabbing question that everyone seems to be asking. With all this chaos, all this talk of new alliances and entirely new systems, is the US dollar, the very bedrock of global finance for nearly a century, actually on its deathbed?
Well, the short answer is no. But the full answer is way more complex and, honestly, a lot more interesting. The dollar isn't dying, but it is getting a demotion. Its job is changing from being the undisputed global manager of the world economy to something more like a powerful but not all-powerful regional power. The world, it turns out, is finally building a plan B.
So what lit the fuse on this whole global rupture? Huge geopolitical shifts like this don't just happen out of nowhere, right? They almost always need a catalyst, some single event that makes a theoretical risk feel suddenly, urgently real. And in this case, the unlikely flashpoint was the Greenland crisis, a dispute over critical minerals and a strategic spot in the Arctic.
It all ignited in early 2026, when the United States threatened its European allies with absolutely crippling tariffs if Denmark, a key NATO partner by the way, refused to cede Greenland. And what's just wild is how fast this all happened. In a matter of weeks, a foundational trust that had existed for decades was just shattered. Allies saw this not as a negotiation tactic, but as a sign that no treaty or trade deal was safe from unilateral American pressure.
And make no mistake, this wasn't some minor threat. The US was talking about a 25% access tax on European goods. For economies that are as intertwined as ours, a tax that big isn't a nuisance, it's an economic weapon. It was this number that forced America's closest allies to realize that relying on the US was no longer a strategy, it was a vulnerability.
Okay, so this forced everyone's hand, which brings us to the first of two massive global reactions. In response to this new uncertainty, the Western-aligned middle powers started building what you could call an economic fortress, a purely defensive strategy to insulate themselves.
And the scale of this is just staggering. We're talking about 39 nations. This isn't some small trade pact. It's the 27 members of the European Union plus the 12 nations of the CPTPP. That's a massive Pacific trade bloc that includes powers like Japan, Canada, Australia, and Mexico, all deciding to team up. They're calling it the Bridge Alliance, and their goal? It's actually brilliantly simple: achieve strategic autonomy. The plan is to create a massive, integrated super supply chain that's so resilient it can function entirely without U.S. parts or markets if it has to, essentially making itself immune to American tariffs or political pressure.
So how on earth do they pull this off? Well, the engine room of this whole alliance runs on two pretty technical concepts: rules of origin and cumulation. But here's what that means in simple terms. A part made in Vietnam can be shipped to Germany for assembly and then sold in Canada, and the whole product is treated as local within the entire 39-nation bloc. It's a simple framework, but it's the key that allows them to literally design the United States out of their supply chains.
Okay, but a project this huge needs money, right? A lot of it. To fund this monumental task, they've created their own financial institution, the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, or DSRB. You can think of it like a World Bank, but for security. By pooling the strong credit ratings of countries like Germany and Japan, it can offer cheap loans to build the mines, the AI data centers, and the energy projects they need for true independence, all without ever asking the US for capital.
But hold on, that defensive fortress? That's only half the story. While America's allies were busy building a shield, another, completely different block of nations was building an entirely new and much more aggressive alternative.
This is where the BRICS Plus nations come in. This group, we're talking China, India, Russia, plus new heavyweights like the UAE and Iran, isn't just trying to protect itself from the dollar system. Oh no, it's building a parallel system from the ground up, one that's focused on physical assets and their own financial infrastructure.
And this isn't some far-off theory. It's happening right now. They're not just talking about it, they're doing it. BRICS central banks are on a gold buying spree, the largest in 70 years, to back their reserves with a hard asset. And it's not just about hoarding gold. Just look at the trade data. Huge chunks of their commerce with each other are now settled in their own currencies, which effectively cuts the dollar right out of the loop.
To make all this trade happen, they're working on a new settlement mechanism, nicknamed the unit. Now, what's really fascinating here is what it's made of. It's a digital unit, sure, but its value is anchored 40% in physical gold. This is a direct challenge to the fiat-based dollar, offering the stability of hard money to the global south.
And you can see the result of all these moves right here on this chart. The dollar's share of global reserves has been in a slow but very steady decline for 2 decades. It's not a sudden collapse, not at all, but it is a clear trend, a strategic, deliberate thinning of the dollar's global footprint as countries actively move their money elsewhere.
So, what's the big takeaway here? The crucial point is that we're just not in a unipolar world anymore, with the US sitting at the center of everything. Instead, what we're seeing is the emergence of a brand new 3-block world order, and each block is operating on a totally different philosophy. So let's put these two Plan Bs side by side for a second. The BRICS Plus factory is driven by what you could call an anti-hegemony philosophy. It's openly confrontational and wants to build a multipolar world. The Bridge Fortress, on the other hand, is more defensive. Its philosophy is strategic autonomy, which is really just the right to not be bullied. One block controls commodities, the other controls high-tech manufacturing. Two very different approaches.
In this slide, honestly, it paints the perfect picture of this new global map. You've got the US as this powerful island, but it's increasingly reliant on its own domestic market. Then you have the fortress of 39 allied nations creating their own self-sufficient ecosystem. And finally, you have the BRICS Plus engine, building completely new infrastructure for the rest of the world. The great integration is over, the great fragmentation has begun.
Okay, so what does this giant geopolitical chess match actually mean for the average person, especially here in the United States? Why should you care? Well, this global decoupling comes with a very, very real price tag.
According to the Tax Foundation, all these tariffs and the higher prices for imported goods that come with them are projected to cost the average American household an extra $1,300 per year. It's basically a hidden tax that gets passed directly to you, the consumer. It's the cost of economic isolation.
And you can see this even more clearly with big purchases, like a car. Breaking up the incredibly integrated North American auto supply chain is projected to add a minimum of $4,000 to the price of a new vehicle. That's a direct consequence of putting up these new trade barriers.
And if we zoom all the way out, the IMF estimates that a full-blown global trade war could shave 0.5 percentage point off of total global GDP. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but it's a massive drag on the world economy that affects jobs, growth, and stability for everyone, everywhere.
Which really leaves us with this final provocative question. In an effort to reassert its dominance and protect its industry, the United States has accidentally spurred the rest of the world to build a system that no longer requires its leadership. The U.S. is still a massive economic power, of course, but for the first time in a lifetime, it's a power that other countries are actively learning to live without. And the question we have to ask now is, what's the long-term price of that isolation?